Just like the rest of the world, I didn't want to die of COVID. But I was just the kind of person who might. I was elderly, late 60s, hypertensive, and male. That was in February 2020. And I was in Bergamo in Italy, which was soon to be the European epicenter of the pandemic. During the third week of that month, the virus was moving stealthfully through the smaller towns of Lombardy, getting ready to pounce on Bergamo. The local newspaper there still only devoted 2 pages a day to obituaries, but that was very soon to change. I think it's helpful to remember how little we knew back then. We knew the virus had come out of China. We knew that in some hospitals in Wuhan, 1 out of every 5 people who caught it died, and they died quickly, drowned in their own lung secretions, often in just a day or 2. We knew that the Chinese doctor who alerted the world to the peril, he was a healthy young man himself, he had died. And now suddenly, the virus was in Italy. It was out there somewhere, but we didn't know where. We had really no idea how to avoid it. We refused to go to public loos for fear of getting infected by the toilet seat or by the sink. We scrubbed our veggies, even our cereal boxes. We debated back and forth whether bleach was better than cleanser, was better than soap. And it was only later that we learned that transmission was largely by aerosol and not really surface contact. But we did know some things, and doctors like myself knew a little bit more than the general public, though not really much more, because most of us had heard about SARS, S-A-R-S, and MERS, M-I-R-S, SARS and MERS. Those were frightening little epidemics which had devastating morbidity and mortality that occurred locally in Asia in terms of SARS and Middle East in terms of MERS during the early and middle 2000s. And now the Chinese virus was spreading across Italy, and it was the same kind of virus as those earlier epidemics. It was a coronavirus. Just that word made me shudder the first time I heard it again. So I didn't want to die from corona. And I was determined not to go to a hospital or to be intubated. So I bought oxygen for home use, not the kind you get in tanks. They're quickly depleted, but there's a new device that extracts oxygen from the air. It's called an oxygen concentrator. And they start about $400 US, and they provide a flow of oxygen indefinitely, no changing of tanks, which is drawn from ambient air and purified. So I ordered one of these from California, along with the tubing, a nasal cannula, and a pulse oximeter. Pulse oximeter is a device you wear on your fingertip. Most of you have seen them in hospitals. It measures the concentration of oxygen in the blood, and it gives you the earliest signal that COVID is moving from a benign stage into the stage that can actually kill you when the O2 sat, that's just short for oxygen saturation, when the O2 sat falls below 80%. And then I stocked up on the medications that we knew at the time to be essential. One was an anticoagulant to thin the blood and prevent the clots and microclots that COVID causes. That's one of the chief ways in which the virus kills. then a glucocorticoid named prednisone, also quite known, I'm sure, to most listeners. It works like cortisone or hydrocortisone. It prevents the hyper-intense immune reaction that fills your lungs up with inflammatory cells and keeps the oxygen from actually getting into your blood. And finally, I procured paracetamol, which is acetaminophen in the US, paracetamol in Europe, for symptomatic relief of pain and headache. And that was all we knew at that time to be effective. And ironically, it remains largely what we know today to be effective. So now I had everything I might receive in a hospital. I'd worked all my life in hospitals, but now I wanted nothing of them. I just wanted what every patient dying in hospital wants: to be at home, to have the luxury of passing away in one's own bed. I didn't want to be awakened in the middle of the night by someone taking my vitals, to be super infected with one of those nosocomial germs that always are circulating in hospitals, or just to have all that hustle and bustle around me when I needed to focus on dying with dignity, on doing my last great task in life with concentrated serenity. Also, I'm a widower and didn't want to bother my children or anyone else. So I got my papers in order. I put them all in one leather case. The deed to my house, a list of all my movable properties, numbers of bank accounts, and I made sure that my will was up to date and in 3 languages: English, Spanish, and French. My children would have to file papers in Belgium, Spain, and in the US. And I left detailed instructions step by step: how to know I was truly dead, the doctor to call to certify my death certificate, what funeral home to call, how I wanted the service conducted, what readings, what hymns. I left the number of my accountant, my lawyer, my banker. Then I talked to my children quite calmly about exactly what to do and when. I showed them how the oxygen concentrator worked, how to turn it on and off, how to put a nasal cannula in case they needed it themselves, and everyone was relieved. In the end, all of this went unused, the oxygen and the meds. I still have the machine and the stocks of meds. It's all still in the boxes. And the briefcase with all the papers is still by my bed. I did get COVID 3 times, but only after I'd been vaccinated. And each time the infection ran a mild to moderate course, which didn't necessitate any life-saving measures. And that brings me to quarantines and vaccines. We live in an age of mistrust. It used to be only neurotics who believed in conspiracies, and only the lunatic fringe believed in global conspiracies. Now, that's become mainstream. Now you're actually seen as naive and misguided if you trust in institutions or believe the majority of people are actually out to improve the world and help their neighbors instead of rip them off. Even my most humane friends say, I believe in individuals, but not in institutions, quote unquote. But what are institutions except a group of individuals who are working together towards a common cause? Anyway, when the history of COVID is written, 50 or 100 years from now, I predict the use of quarantine and vaccines will be seen as critical, heroic steps that prevented disaster. What disaster, you may wonder? In those early days, just after Wuhan was devastated, and then Lombardy and then Spain, We knew one thing with rather terrifying certainty. We knew the case mortality rate. The case mortality rate. That means how many of those who get infected with COVID actually die. So in late March and early April 2020, we already knew that number. It came to us from Wuhan, it came to us from Lombardy, and it was 2%. So 2 out of every 100 persons with COVID died. Before vaccines, of course, and before quarantine. Now that's lower than SARS, that earlier epidemic, or lower than MERS, lower than the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1919. But it's still a rather staggering number when you consider the world population, which is nearly 8 billion people. So what does that case mortality rate mean? It means that if you do nothing, you just let the virus rip, as some countries, including the UK, were initially tempted to do, it will infect everyone in the world, since no one had immunity and the virus is highly communicable. And 2% of those infected will die. So now let's do the math. What is 2% of 8 billion? Amazingly, it's 160 million. Let's say that another way. If we just let COVID rip, not taking the measures of social distancing, masking, quarantine, and warp speed vaccine development, and then jabbing, and then boosting, 160 million people would have died. 160 million. I think I hear people sniggering, poo-pooing all that, and scratching their heads in disbelief. Again, we live in this age of distrust. And I'm a doctor, plus I'm a white, straight male, so obviously I'm just the kind of person one should never trust. But we also live in an age of ignorance. We just don't believe such a thing could happen. And we don't realize it's actually happened before. So could a virus kill in a lightning bolt of time, just a few weeks, the equivalent of the entire population of the United Kingdom times 2? No way. Our doubting Thomases obviously are shaking their heads. But consider for a moment 1918. How many people did that influenza virus, which we mistakenly call the Spanish flu, how many did that influenza virus kill? Well, the answer is no one knows for sure because they never counted the dead in India or China, which even then were the most populous countries in the world. But by extrapolating from the statistics we do have, which are quite reliable, it appears that 100 million people died. 100 million. 1918 to 1919, 100 million. And that was at a time when there were less than 2 billion people on the globe, not 8. So 4 times less than now. And they died quickly. They were often well in the morning, had a sore throat around noontime, were bedridden in the afternoon, and were cold, stone cold dead before sundown one day. They went quickly. To make it worse, that virus had a special trophism, meaning it has special predilection for the young. That means it killed teens and young adults by preference. For example, troop ships of soldiers, Canadian soldiers, leaving the trenches of the First World War, which had just ended that year, those troop ships would slip hundreds of dead bodies into the sea every night. All of them victims of the virus. So much so you could actually track the route of the ship for hundreds of miles by the floating bodies it left behind. They'd arrived back in Newfoundland after a 10-day voyage from Europe with only half of the 6,000 soldiers that they started with. When it was all said and done, the Spanish flu had killed more people than all of World War I, and by several orders of magnitude. But who remembers that today? People remember wars. They memorize wars in school. People remember wars. They forget pandemics. So it has happened. It has devastated humanity before. And it would have happened again. We were saved. How? By those simple rules. Stay at home, only go out for food and medicines, stand 2 meters apart, wash your hands, wear a mask, and finally take the jab, and then take the booster. That saved us. Of course, no country got it exactly right. There were starts and stops, there were wrong turns, reversals, contradictions. But remember, we didn't know shit at that time. Still, that's the miracle we've just lived through. And most of us don't even realize it. Most people are so busy resenting the nuisance of these measures or speculating whether it was all a hoax or raving that big pharma fleeced us. So busy, they don't realize we've just lived through a miracle. So you ask, how many people actually died from COVID? Well, the best estimates to date are 7 million people have died of COVID worldwide. And that's probably something of an underestimate. And of course, every one of those deaths was a tragedy, and every family's loss was a calamity to them. And almost all of those 7 million would still be alive today, but for COVID. But 7 million is a far cry from 160 million. And it would have happened. It would have happened. Anyone who doubts that fact just hasn't looked carefully at what was happening during the first 2 months of 2020 in central China, in the hospitals and emergency rooms and intensive care wards of all those hospitals around Wuhan. And anyone who doubts it, doubts the fact that it would have happened, anyone who doubts that wasn't like I was in Bergamo, Italy, in March and April 2020, where I saw the obituary notices in the newspaper go from an average of 2 pages a day to 60 pages a day, a 30-fold increase in only 1 week. So the scythe of death slashed through an entire generation of Italians, most of them my age, in the twinkling of an eye. That would have happened worldwide, and it didn't. And it was a miracle, a modern medical miracle. And those of us in the medical profession just shake our heads at smart people, sensible people, well-informed people who deny the efficacy of vaccines or who refuse to take the COVID vaccine, claiming their own immune system is strong enough to fight off the virus, or that they don't trust the vaccine development process or the developers. Parents who wouldn't dream of not vaccinating their own children against all the childhood diseases say these things about the COVID vaccine. They say it was developed too fast, wasn't tested adequately, was only a money-making scheme. Okay, I'm not disparaging them. These are smart people on the whole. Ironically, they are the same ones who trust that others will drive on the correct side of the road, that the food they buy at the supermarket is safe to eat, that the bills they carry in their wallet will be accepted as valid tender of custom. These are all elements of trust, all the vital glue that holds our civilization together. Trust, confidence, trust in each other. These are the same people who believe that they could be harmed by a COVID jab, that claim that clinical studies involving 400,000 subjects, where have we ever seen clinical studies that powerful, that huge, 400,000 subjects, in which no one got an additional injury after vaccination, claiming that those studies are not reliable. And furthermore, they even wonder out loud whether somebody hasn't nefariously slipped a chip into the vaccine vials. So we've discussed this as doctors, and we've wondered what has happened to lead us to such a confused, contradictory, counterproductive mindset. So one colleague of mine, another doctor, asked me whether if we could take people back just for a week to Victorian times and let them see all those children who were dying before their fourth or fifth birthday. Diseases like measles and rubella and smallpox, things we never see anymore, whether that would make any difference in the way people view vaccines. Or what if we just explain to people the nature of viruses and how they arise, how they mutate, how they hijack our cells, how they intercalate into their own genes, into our DNA, and use our own DNA to multiply and replicate. Another colleague said, well, we should show them how the RNA and DNA platforms work, the vaccine platforms. That this is a marvelous, incredible vehicle. It's as wonderful and complex as the Saturn rocket. Let's just show them how vaccines actually work. Or explain to them how the immune system, how our human immune system processes these antigens that we inject with vaccines, these inert viral antigens, how they make, or how we make antibodies that protect us. It's a miracle of vaccines, the most effective medical tool ever invented. Would that finally change people's mindset? We had this debate, and I shook my head. I just doubt it. I just don't think so. Once your mind is made up. But how can I blame them? I'm just as silly about other things. They're just as blind as they are. We are, after all, a silly race, a silly human race. And blindness is comforting when everyone else is blind. And willful blindness is actually a salve when you're really too afraid to open your eyes and see.